The pandemic has taken a toll on the mental health of virtually everyone it's touched, but for many in the restaurant industry, whose workers were already in high-stress jobs before COVID-19 closures, the strains of the last year plus have made a difficult problem even worse. That's why tomorrow, McLean Hospital is teaming up with the group Rise Hospitality and a few other industry leaders for a virtual discussion focused on how workers can recognize mental health crises and help themselves and others through them. I'm joined by two of tomorrow's speakers. Dr. Ipsit Vahai is a mental health expert and the medical director of the McLean Institute for Technology and Psychiatry. Doctor, it's good to meet you. And Douglas Williams, the award-winning chef owner of MIDA in Boston and now Newton as well. And Douglas, it's good to see you as always. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
Douglas, if I
Thanks
can
for having us.
Start with you, my pleasure. High stress, depression, addiction, sexual harassment, that's not new to the restaurant industry. So is the concern that's the focus of tomorrow with the labor shortage and obviously coming off 15 months of this horror, that all of that becomes potentially exacerbated? Is that what it's all about?
Yeah, I think I first want to start up and just say that it exists in every industry, but in this sort of environment, obviously, it can be increased, and because the systems are not as quick as maybe white collar industries, things can lag and things get lost and forgotten sometimes, and that's a shame because everybody needs a lot of attention, especially in this industry. So I think we want to, with this webinar and this business, we want to try to make sure we're bringing those things to light and giving them some attention. But I do think it will be increasing. But that's why we're here to try to step in and help out.
But Douglas, is it the nature of the industry or the nature of some of the bosses, some of the employers that's a problem?
Both. Every industry has their, firefighter has particular dangers, and the restaurant industry, being in, obviously, aside from the fire and the sharp things and everything is metal and slippery floors and all these things, there's dangers. But as far as mental health and what that does to you, being in a high stress environment, being in this industry it's already a difficult industry, but then you add other, natural elements of the world and of society to that, and then it really starts to compound. And that's if you're a healthy, normal, not normal person, but someone who has their maybe stress under control. But then you take someone who maybe has, an instance in their life that has changed them and has affected them. You put them in that environment, and you can have some personal issues that go out of control.
Dr. Vahai, it's sort of the infamous story is how when you're in the military, if the injury is not visible, it doesn't exist. Is there a comparable sort of denial in this industry?
I think so. I think in general, mental health is something that people are loath to talk about unless either they're really suffering or they're in an environment where these conversations are facilitated. I think one of our hopes with the session tomorrow is to sort of make the point that step one is to create an environment where it's okay to even bring these things up. I think there has been a culture in many industries where you're expected to be tough and bear it. And we've seen that was not a positive way to deal with mental health to begin with. I think the pandemic has just exacerbated all of this. I think the combined stress of personal risk from the pandemic and disruptions in one's personal lives in a place like the restaurant industry, which has been ravaged by the events of the past year and a half. I think there's a layer of personal and professional stress and then economic uncertainty to go with that. So I think there's a complicated mix of factors, and we know that the rates of mental illness are higher across the board at this point in time. And the restaurant industry has a unique confluence of factors that sort of make restaurant workers at risk. We also know that younger people have been struggling more than older adults, and the restaurant industry does skew younger. So change would start with creating first dialogue among people to even bring these things up.
But dialogue with whom? I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear to me is somebody who about 100 years ago worked in the restaurant industry, me, and somebody who spends a lot of times in restaurants now, there is no faster moving world than the world of the restaurant. Who does someone, when you said a second ago, doctor, that the worker has to know they can bring this up, who do they bring it up with, particularly if their employer is the source of the problem?
I think that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach. I think, as Douglas said, the restaurant industry is not a monolith, and then every restaurant may be different. It could vary. It could be a peer, it could be a colleague, it could be a supervisor or a manager, but it could also be someone in the environment that they can trust and either get support where they work, but it could be someone in their personal lives. I think if the situation is serious enough, then they need to know how and when to access formal care.
Douglas, has this been an issue for you as well? I mean, we focus a lot on restaurant workers, but how about for the people who run restaurants in this industry, particularly coming out of this crisis of the last 15 months? Are mental health concerns common among you and your peers as well?
I think I believe so, and I know so. I don't like to say I know so in absolution, but obviously, any normal person, which I guess I am, but I also am not. We all have our own day and our own things that kind of settle out, whether it be childhood or adolescence or even adulthood, things that just happen to us, and we carry those things through our cooking years and our training years, which for me it was about 20 years and just sort of ended until we're training now, figuring out this business part. And I think that you can't help but bring those things with you into a more mature adulthood that you still have to settle, because you actually haven't had time the past 20 years to fix them, because you've been so focused on your craft and focused on getting to a point that you can sustain yourself. Because I have, for me, I have no net to fall into that I can go back on a certain degree and figure it out. This is the last frontier for me, and I have to make it count. So that gives me a focus. And when I have a goal to focus on, especially with mental health, a lot of times we're trying to do a lot of things at one time. But for me, I have to focus on a singular goal and try to find the people to help me achieve that. And that actually has been my saving grace, coming from having Crohn's disease and how that's affected me as a younger adult.
Douglas, right shortly before he died, Anthony Bourdain was on this show, and we talked about this very subject. And I asked him if he looked back, were there things that he regretted in terms of how he treated people who worked for him that he knew better. Do you share some of those kinds of concerns looking back on your career, or do you think you've pretty much gotten it right?
No, goodness, yes. I mean, there's all forms of ways I think I could have either guided or stepped in. But again, hindsight is like, it's very strong right now. Everyone has this very strong form of, what I could have done, what I should have done, what I would. And especially this past year, we all were very, very, everybody was in the same boat this past year. Yeah. And no one was smarter than others. It's as if everything was kind of stripped away. And I think that's no matter where you are on the scale, of the richness in which your life holds or has or significance right now, you still feel it. And that's why the pandemic was so visceral and sharp. And I think that's why it affects everyone in every form of life right now, especially in this culture. So it puts us all on the same playing field, which is a very vulnerable but also opportunistic place to be. I think that we've all seen. So it's very, very rattling.
Doctor, last thing I have time for is you talked about how there's so many young people in this industry, there's a lot of turnover, that sort of thing. It amazes me that the stigma that we were talking about decades ago continues to exist, particularly with young people who are so much more open, in my experience, about issues like mental health and that sort of thing. So is the stigma lessening in whatever this year is, 2021, or are we suffering with it just like we have forever?
I believe it is lessening. I think there's a lot more out there in a number of different domains. I mean, we're having this conversation. I also think, though, that part of the stigma was just the relatability of mental illness. I think there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. And mental illness may not be relatable, but if we've learned anything from the past year, it's, I would ask this, everyone listening in can relate to that sense of being tired, even though they had a good night's sleep and not knowing why. I think that's an example of how, even for people that don't have mental illness, I think it's just gotten easier to relate to the idea of mental health and well-being. So I think conversations are beginning. I think there's at least openness to talking about mental health and well-being, if not quite mental illness yet. But I think it's a process, and I think we've come farther along, and we're farther along today than we've ever been.
I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, gentlemen. Dr. Vahai, Douglas, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Good luck tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.